Hey everybody, welcome to the beginning of a new series on this channel where I will be exploring the lives of every American president in the order of their presidency, one biography at a time. I've been working on this project behind the scenes on our channel for a long time, so you may see some familiar sights along the way. My approach to selecting the books is simple. I have headed to the nearest used bookstore in my area and selected the highest rated biography on each president and then read it cover to cover. Along the way, I highlighted favorite passages that struck me the most, and I want to share these passages with you here in this series. I should tell you up front, I was never very good at giving book reports in school, so I am actually going to read my favorite parts from every biography more or less verbatim straight from the book. Anytime I insert my own opinion, it will be clearly obvious. Otherwise, I will be reporting directly from the author's own words what I found to be the most interesting in each biography on each unique president. This series is not meant to be a lecture or a textbook, it's just my impressions that revealed who our presidents really were beyond the portraits and monuments. For visual interest, whenever I finished a book, I walked it to the nearest little free library to donate so that the story could continue on in someone else's hands. I hope each volume will make its way back into the community and spark curiosity in another reader, just as it did for me. We will begin this series with a book about George Washington, our nation's first president, through the biography known as His Excellency, written by Joseph J. Ellis and published in 2004. I first read this book while we were living in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2025. I enjoyed the book so much, I read it a second time after we returned to Charlotte, North Carolina, because I hadn't had time to find a biography on John Adams yet. At 275 pages long, this book was an easily digestible work that did not take me very long to read from cover to cover. I feel like Joseph Ellis did an incredible job plotting all the major events throughout George Washington's life and how they shaped him into a man of greatness. And Ellis created a relatable image of the human being behind the marble and the portraits. Let's jump right into this first book, which sets the tone for this new series. I will share my favorite passages straight from the book, and I invite you to walk to the nearest little free library with me as we explore history one president at a time. Chapter 1: Interior Regions. History first noticed George Washington in 1753 as a daring and resourceful 21-year-old messenger sent on a dangerous mission into the American wilderness. He published an account of his adventures titled The Journal of Major George Washington, which appeared in several colonial newspapers and was reprinted in magazines in England. Washington said very little about himself in his journal and nothing at all about what he was thinking. In 1753, Washington was ordered to lead a small party over the Blue Ridge Mountains and rendezvous with an influential Indian chief called the Half King. Then he was to proceed on to the French outpost at present-day Erie, Pennsylvania, to deliver a message from Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia in the name of His Britannic Majesty. The key passage in the letter he was carrying represented the opening verbal shot in the French and Indian War, as the king was making it clear to both French settlers and the native Indians that the lands upon the River Ohio are notoriously known to be the property of the Crown of Great Britain. It is a matter of equal concern and surprise to hear that a body of French forces are erecting fortresses and making settlements upon that river. The French listened politely to Washington's claims, but little impression was made upon them. They drafted a cordial letter for him to return to Governor Dinwiddie, essentially rejecting British authority in the entire area. In his journal, Washington writes more about his encounter with the Half King, the chief of the Seneca, who was the diplomatic representative of the Iroquois Confederation known as the Six Nations. Washington was given the Indian name of Connocticarius, which means town taker, a name which originally belonged to his great-grandfather John Washington a full century earlier. The Half-King regarded the French settlers as a great threat to Indian sovereignty, who did not come in peace as the British settlers did. The French were building houses and fortresses and taking land by force. Unbeknownst to the Half-King, the British ministry and colonial government fully intended to occupy the Ohio County with Anglo-American settlers once control of the region had been established, settlers whose presence with the natives was completely incompatible. Although Washington's role in these relation negotiations was small, this was the first time that his personal life had been caught up in a larger public cause. Not much is recorded about George Washington's life prior to 1753. He was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, near the banks of the Potomac River on February 22, 1732, a fourth-generation Virginian, but very much a subject of the British Crown. His great-grandfather, John Washington, had come over from England in 1657 and established the family as respectable, though not prominent, members of Virginia's society. The natives had named John Town Taker not because of his military prowess, but because he had manipulated the law to swindle them out of their land. George Washington received the modern equivalent of a grade school education, but was never exposed to the classical curriculum or encouraged to attend college, a deficiency that haunted him throughout his life. He became obsessed with deportment, believing that every action done in company ought to be done with some sign of respect to those who are present. The two major influences on his youthful development were his older half-brother Lawrence and the Fairfax family. Lawrence had become a surrogate father and took young George to Barbados in 1751, which was George's one and only trip abroad. George contracted smallpox in Barbados, and though he survived, he carried the pockmarks on his face for the rest of his life. In 1752, Lawrence died of tuberculosis, leaving George the inheritor of a 2,500-acre plantation known as Mount Vernon. The Fairfax family had considerable influence over young George also. Lawrence had married Anne Fairfax, a daughter of a dynasty of wealthy landowners. In 1748, William Fairfax gave young George his first job, accompanying William's son George on a surveying expedition of the Fairfax family's holdings in the Shenandoah Valley. On this expedition, George realized that the frontier region of the continent was sparsely settled, virtually considered the edge of the world, and certainly far beyond any type of civilization he had ever encountered. He witnessed an Indian war party, scalping, and victory dancing. George grew tall and strong in these years that he spent surveying. In 1752, when he returned home to Mount Vernon as his brother lay dying, he petitioned Virginia Governor Dinwiddie to take the post in the Virginia militia made available by his brother's illness and subsequent death. He had no military experience whatsoever, but William Fairfax used his influence to assure Dinwiddie that George was up to the task. Over the next 5 years, from 1754 to 1759, Washington spent the bulk of his time west of the Blue Ridge Mountains leading expeditions into the Ohio country, which served as a crash course in soldiering. Instead of going to college, Washington went to war. In the spring of 1754, he left Alexandria, Virginia, at the head of 160 troops with the mission of securing the strategic location at the juncture of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, where construction had begun on a stronghold named Fort Necessity. After arriving, he found that a French force of more than 1,000 troops had seized the half-built fort and renamed it Fort Duquesne. From this fort, they were radiating French influence over the Indian tribes in the region. Through intelligence, Washington found out that 32 French soldiers were encamped in a forest glen. Washington and 40 in his detachment, plus the Half-King and his allies, encircled the French camp. It has remained a controversy ever since who fired the first shot in the French and Indian War. This was Washington's first real combat experience, and there is good reason to believe that he found himself witnessing a massacre. The most plausible version of the evidence suggests that the French troops, caught surprised and outgunned, threw down their weapons and attempted to surrender. The French commander named Jumonville attempted to explain that he had come on a peace mission on behalf of King Louis XV. Washington was attempting to understand the translation of this information when the Half-King, who was much more fluent in French, decided to take matters into his own hands. He stepped up to Jumonville and split his skull in half with a hatchet, pulled out his brain, and washed his hands in the mixture of blood and tissue. His warriors then fell upon the rest of the French soldiers, scalped them all, and decapitated one to put his head on a stake. All of this happened under the eyes of a shocked and helpless Colonel Washington. In writing back to Governor Dinwiddie, Washington did not tell an outright lie about what happened, but he also did not tell the whole truth. He attempted to believe that the French were lying about coming under a banner of peace and rationalized the massacre to himself. In a letter home, he wrote, "I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." This self-promoting statement made its way all the way to London, where King George II reportedly dismissed it as youthful bragging. Washington rose to the rank of colonel after the death of the previous commander, yet again advancing due to the death of another. On June 18th, the Half-King arranged a council of Indians to which Washington responded to questions about English intentions in the Ohio country. He apprised that the sole purpose of the English military effort was to maintain their rights and to make the whole country safe to them. He claimed that the English had no other goal than to recover for the Indian tribes those lands that the French had taken from them, which was a bald-faced lie derived from the fact that Washington knew the military campaigns would be unsuccessful without the Indian cooperation. The Half-King led his Indians into the woods, abandoning Washington and Fort Necessity to their fates. Washington wrote about what happened next, although his version does not fit with the bulk of evidence. A force of 1,100 French and Indians descended on Fort Necessity, and because Washington had only cleared the trees and brush 60 yards around the fort, the forces were able to take refuge in the forest and advance within firing range of the fort. Washington wrote that the defenders of Fort Necessity were inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy, and the French commander called for a truce of surrender. But somehow it was the defenders under Washington who were forced under the terms of the treaty to evacuate the fort carrying their arms, colors, and honor. In Washington's version, what was most likely a solid defeat was retold as a stalemate in which the Virginians and the British conducted themselves with gallantry and composure. It's more likely that Washington had placed his troops in a hopelessly vulnerable position and likely faced a slow-paced slaughter that lasted for 9 hours and cost him 100 casualties. Washington's signature on the surrender document endorsed the fact that the British in general were responsible for murdering Jumonville, the diplomat on a peace emissary of the French crown, which ultimately meant that the British were responsible for the hostile action that launched the French and Indian War. Washington went to his grave insisting that he had never realized that the word assassination was included in the surrender document, and he blamed the misunderstanding on a translation error. Washington led the remnant of his regiment out of Fort Necessity on July 4th, a day he surely never thought he would celebrate. In Williamsburg, William Fairfax used his influence to depict the Fort Necessity debacle as a noble but futile effort to block the French invasion of Virginia's western lands. The House of Burgesses issued an order recognizing Washington for his late gallant and brave behavior in the defense of his country. Washington was ultimately vindicated. However, the Virginia regiment that he had led was disbanded into several independent companies, leaving him to serve at a lower rank. This struck him as an insult because he was very proud of his rank. Lacking aristocratic credentials like Fairfax or London connections like Dinwiddie, his military position was his primary indication of social standing. Rather than accept the demotion, he resigned in November of 1754, convinced that he had found his proper calling as a soldier. In February 1755, 2 regiments of British regulars under General Edward Braddock were dispatched with specific orders to launch the campaign against the French menace by recapturing Fort Duquesne. Braddock knew all there was to know about drilling troops, something about waging war in Europe, and absolutely nothing about the savage battlefields he would encounter in the American interior. Braddock's mission was doomed to failure from the beginning. He sealed his fate completely when he met with a delegation of Indian chiefs and told them that their historic claims to the land in the Ohio Valley were worthless and that British troops had no need of aid from savages, which caused most of the tribes in the region to align with the French. Braddock was very glad to have Washington in his company and gave him the position of an aide-de-camp on his staff in May of 1755. Braddock realized he faced a massive logistical problem to mount a siege of the fort because he would require overwhelming superiority in both manpower and artillery. This cumbersome cavalcade and all of Braddock's extensive military experience worked against him. Washington recommended that Braddock send a flying column of 1,200 lightly equipped troops to proceed at full speed towards the fort, advice that Braddock accepted. However, on July 9th, disaster occurred within the first 10 minutes of engagement when their ranks were decimated and a panic set in. It was a complete debacle. Entire companies were wiped out by friendly fire, and Braddock himself was cut down with mortal wounds. It fell to Washington to rally the troops. 2 horses were shot out beneath him, and 4 musket balls pierced his coat, but he miraculously escaped without a scratch. Washington never forgot the screams of the wounded that fell during the panicked retreat as they were being scalped. Braddock died within 3 days of the disaster, and Washington buried him in the middle of the road and then ran wagons over his grave to prevent his body from being desecrated. At first, Washington was in complete disbelief that a force so large and well-equipped could be so thoroughly defeated. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the very size of Braddock's force, plus his cumbersome artillery train that eventually proved useless, actually contributed to the fiasco. Washington was hailed the hero of the Monongahela for his part in rallying the survivors in an orderly retreat, and for a second time he emerged from a disastrous defeat with an enhanced status. His specialty seemed to be exhibiting courage in lost causes. In August of 1755, Washington's ascending reputation made him the obvious choice to command the newly created Virginia Regiment, and for the next 3.5 years, he recruited, trained, and led what became an elite unit of over 1,000 men that combined the spit and polish discipline of British regulars with the tactical agility and proficiency of Indian warriors. The Virginia Regiment itself was the first institution over which he exercised executive authority and was a projection of his own developing convictions as both an officer and an inspiring gentleman. The Virginia Regiment under Washington was given the task of providing security over a region that was entirely indefensible, but for the most part there were no set-piece battles, just savage skirmishes that often ended in massacres. From start to finish, he complained, as he would throughout the entire War for Independence, that he had been given responsibilities without the resources to meet them. He strongly supported the attempt to recruit Catawba and Cherokee warriors from the Carolinas into his new regiment, but the Indian populations remained mostly pro-French. Washington designed the distinctive uniforms of his regiment himself as an outward manifestation of the larger goal, which was to make the regiment a truly special unit, able to master the bushfighting tactics with Indian-like proficiency. Washington had begun to regard himself as superior to anyone, British or American, in conducting this type of guerrilla warfare, and it rankled him that neither he nor his troops were paid at the same rate as British regulars. Most of his recruits were recently arrived immigrants or second-generation tradesmen. He maintained a proper social distance from the enlisted men, but he knew most of them personally. Although most of them were older than he was, he cultivated the image of a caring but strict father towards his children. His discipline was harsh, and he routinely contrasted the discipline of his own regiment with the undependable militia. The ranks of the militia were made up with small farm landowners whose short terms of enlistment made them virtually worthless in a war that put a premium on staying power. Washington did not believe one could trust in the principle of voluntarism or the spontaneous expression of public virtue to meet a wartime crisis, a conviction that he never abandoned throughout his entire life. Cultivated through errors made during his time as a commander of the Virginia Regiment, Washington's abiding respect for civilian authority and strict obedience to civilian control over the military eventually became one of his greatest legacies. Two features of the great Washington as we know him today were beginning to emerge: his aversion to criticism, especially when the criticism questioned his personal motives that he insisted were above reproach, and a capacity to play politics effectively while claiming total disinterest in the game. The woman that Washington decided to marry was Martha Dandridge Custis, probably the wealthiest widow in Virginia and the prize catch of Chesapeake society. However, he was actually passionately in love with another woman named Sally Fairfax, who was already married to his best friend, George William Fairfax. The titillating consummation question is as irrelevant as it is unanswerable. The more important fact is that Washington possessed a deep-seated capacity to feel powerful emotions. He became the most notorious model of self-control in all of American history, the original Marble Man. But he achieved this reputation through a lifetime of soldiering by direct experience with difficulty and posturing. What would, in later years of his life, be regarded as an arrogant aloofness began in his young adulthood as a wholly protective urge to establish space around himself that bullets, insults, and criticism could never penetrate. He emerged from traumatic experiences unscathed and with his reputation each time higher than before. Shortly before his marriage to Martha, Washington resigned his commission with the intention of moving to Mount Vernon and establishing a proper family. Whatever he felt towards Sally Fairfax, she was a forbidden temptation that could not fit into the domestic picture he had formed in his head. Memories of her were buried deep in his heart and could not interfere with his careful management of his ascending prospects. Chapter 2: The Strenuous Squire. Over the course of his long public career, Washington made several decisions that shaped the basic contours of American history, but nothing he ever did had a greater influence on the shape of his own life than the decision to marry Martha Dandridge Custis. Her huge dowry immediately catapulted him into the top tier of Virginia's planter class and established the economic foundation for his second career as the master of Mount Vernon, the home and plantation he had inherited from his brother Lawrence's widow on her death in 1761. Between the time that he moved in with Martha and the time that he departed for the war against Great Britain, Washington had more than doubled the size of his land holdings, from about 3,000 to 6,500 acres. But if the main source of Martha's appeal was initially more economic than romantic, there is reason to believe that the relationship soon developed into an intimate and mutually affectionate bond of considerable affinity. The fact that they had no children of their own is almost certainly not a sign that they were sexually incompatible, but rather that Washington himself was most probably sterile. As for the suppressed feelings for Sally Fairfax, all the evidence suggests that everyone behaved themselves. Sally and George William were the closest neighbors and became good friends of Martha and George, and the most frequent guests at Mount Vernon. It seems likely that both Martha and George William realized that their respective partners had a past, but the longer no one mentioned it, the more it became history. As a stepfather to Martha's two children from her previous marriage, Washington was dutiful and engaged. However, he consistently deferred to Martha on all matters of parenting and discipline. Her son Jackie was raised with all the advantages and privileges that Washington himself had been denied. Jackie unfortunately failed at managing land and died young in 1781, just as Washington was sealing the American victory at Yorktown. Martha's daughter Patsy suffered with seizures and died at the age of 17. Beyond being a landowner and farming, Washington enjoyed fox hunting, breeding hounds, horse racing, playing cards, drinking fine wine, and fine clothing. His outfits never truly fit him properly because he never sent in the proper measurements to his tailor. In 1772, Washington chose to wear his old military uniform for a portrait done by Charles Willson Peale because his uniform fit him better than any of his tailored clothes ever did. A lukewarm Episcopalian, he never took communion, and he tended to talk about providence or destiny rather than God. Most of the work done on his plantations was performed by African slaves, and at this stage in his life, there is no evidence that Washington experienced any moral anxiety about owning other human beings. Later in his career, especially after his experience in the American Revolution and exposure to a broader set of opinions on the matter, he developed a more critical perspective on the institution of slavery. His one concession of humanity on the matter was his refusal to sell slaves from his farm without their consent if it would involve breaking up a family. He was solicitous about their health, warning his overseers not to work them in bad weather, and he took charge personally when disease broke out in the slave quarters, but he was motivated more by maintaining productivity of his plantation than by humanity. There were some slaves on his property who enjoyed considerable freedom. Washington maintained an obsessive concern with his own economic interests that no proper gentleman was supposed to feel. He was not a man to the manner born, but a recently arrived aristocrat who, before he married a fortune, was accustomed to scrambling, literally dodging bullets, a man unwilling and unable to take anything for granted. He regarded any failure on the part of others to meet his exacting standards as a personal affront, and persistent failure was evidence of a conspiracy to deprive him of what was rightfully his. With Martha came a connection with merchants in London in the form of a man named Robert Carey, head of Carey and Company, who had handled the business of Martha's first husband and the Custis estate, which was 3 plantations totaling 18,000 acres and nearly 300 slaves. However, Washington soon became caught up in the trap that was snaring so many other Virginia planters, including Thomas Jefferson, the chronic condition of indebtedness, which soon became hereditary and passed down the generations alongside owning large amounts of land. Washington accused Carey of deliberately selling him inferior products and hiking up the price by 20% just because he was a mere American colonist and presumably too ignorant to know the difference. He was quite convinced that Carey regarded him as an inferior and quickly grew to not trust him. All evidence suggests that Robert Carey most likely dealt fairly and honestly with the Washington account. Historians of the planter class have documented the inherent difficulties of growing tobacco and expecting it to be a cash crop. The lavish lifestyles of the Virginia planters and their obliviousness to the bottom line, combined with an apparently irresistible urge to imitate the styles and consumption on level with the English gentry, placed their economic fate entirely in the hands of merchants. Every time an invoice from Carey and Company arrived at Mount Vernon, it served as a stark statement of Washington's dependence on invisible men in faraway places. If the core economic problem was tobacco, the core psychological problem was control, the highest emotional priority for Washington, which, once threatened, set off internal alarms that never stopped ringing. The much despised Stamp Act was scheduled to go into effect in Virginia in the fall of 1765. The Stamp Act was Parliament's first effort to impose a direct tax on the colonies in order to help defray the costs of managing its expanding empire, primarily during the French and Indian War. Washington's response to the Stamp Act reflected his personal experience with Carey and Company, and he suggested the ill-judged measures were likely to have the ironic effect of reducing American dependence on British imports. He anticipated that the colonies would dispense the lavish luxuries of Great Britain because the necessities of life could be had within themselves. His thinking, conditioned by his personal experience with the practical operation of the British Empire, instinctively moved to the much more palpable issue of economic independence. Washington chose to start by liberating himself from Carey and Company. In 1766, he abandoned tobacco as his cash crop at Mount Vernon, one of the first major Virginia planters to do so. From then on, he grew wheat. He constructed his own mill to grind it into flour and sold it in Alexandria and Norfolk. He built his own schooner and harvested fish from the Potomac to sell locally and in the Caribbean. Eventually, he purchased a ship to carry his products to markets as far distant as Portugal. He developed a full-scale spinning and weaving operation at Mount Vernon. He was never able to be completely free of tobacco farming, since it remained the chief crop of the Custis plantations that he managed, and he was never able to completely free himself from Carey and Company, which continued to fill annual orders for him up until 1774. Despite this, he was determined to defy the pattern of indebtedness that swallowed up so much of the Virginia planter class. In hindsight, he was already in personal rebellion against the Slavish seductions of the British Empire. The first renovation at Mount Vernon was completed in 1759, when the main entrance was switched from the east to the west side of the mansion. Among the architectural reasons for the change was an expression of Washington's deepest conviction that the future of the Americas lay in the wild and wooded lands of the Ohio country that he had explored and fought over as a young man. A basic conflict about the future of Ohio country was that Washington believed the land was open to settlement, the British government believed it was closed, and the Indians believed it was theirs. In 1763, King George III issued a proclamation in effect making the enormous region from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi an Indian reservation, a proclamation that Washington viewed as a preposterous joke. He regarded the Indian tribes in the region as a series of holding companies destined to be displaced as the growing wave of white settlers flowed over the Alleghenies. There was nothing right or wrong about this development in his mind. It was simply and obviously inevitable. Later, during his presidency, he would attempt to guarantee tribal control over Indian enclaves. Washington personally believed that there was a race going on for the bounty of half of a continent, and thousands of colonial settlers were swarming across the Alleghenies every year, establishing their claim not just by a legal appeal to authority, but by the physical act of occupying and cultivating the land. He knew that if he played by the British rules, which refused to acknowledge that a race was even occurring, others who ignored the rules would claim the best of the bounty. He knew that the colonies needed to expand and grow, and the British government seemed determined to block that expansion. In 1774, he received word that the Secretary of State for the American Colonies had ruled that land grants to veterans of the French and Indian War promised in the Proclamation of 1763 would be restricted to British regulars only, which to him was an extreme injustice. While the blocked claim for expansion was allegedly to protect Indian rights, he believed more probably the true reason was to reserve the land for London cronies. As far as the American West was concerned, Washington was already declaring his own independence. The Townshend Act of 1768 was a clever measure that imposed new duties on colonial imports, which the British claimed were not, strictly speaking, taxes. Multiple petitions and remonstrations to the king or parliament had been ineffectual, and the plaintive character of such petitions irritated Washington because it seemed to reinforce the sense of subordination and subservience the colonies were protesting against and that he found so personally offensive. In his deep contempt towards English presumptions of superiority, Washington began urging Virginians to embrace the same economic self-sufficiency that he had decided to implement at Mount Vernon. In 1769, he presented a proposal in the House of Burgesses calling for a colony-wide boycott of English manufactured goods that included a cessation of the slave trade. This made him an unofficially acknowledged leader in the resistance movement within Virginia's planter class. The Intolerable Acts that passed in the summer of 1774 closed Boston's port and imposed martial law on Massachusetts as punishment for the orchestrated riot known as the Boston Tea Party. Washington detected a full-blooded conspiracy against American liberty and compared the new regulations to slavery, probably because he understood firsthand the limitless opportunity for abuse once control was vested in another higher power. He conferred with George Mason that summer as Mason was drafting the Fairfax Resolves, which warned of a concerted British plan to make all colonists into slaves. Washington actually chaired the meeting in Alexandria when the Fairfax Resolves were formally adopted and a recommendation was put forward for a Continental Congress to approve a comprehensive boycott of British imports. At the psychological core was his utter loathing for any form of dependency, a sense of his own significance, and a deep distrust of any authority beyond his direct control. Before he left town, he purchased a new sash and epaulettes for his old military uniform, inquired about the price of muskets, and ordered a book written by Thomas Webb called A Military Treatise on the Appointments of the Army. Though he still hoped a war could be avoided, he was now actively preparing for one. Each time there had been a crisis before with the British government had stepped back from the precipice, as with revoking the Stamp and Townshend Acts. Although King George III had declared the American colonies to be in a state of open rebellion, Washington still continued to hope and believe that cool heads in London would prevail. However, throughout the spring of 1775, county militia units were being organized throughout the colonies. As Virginia's most famous war hero, Washington was the obvious choice of commander. In March, 5 independent companies had invited him to lead them. Military preparations replaced political augmentation in Virginia as the highest priority. With the British troops occupying Boston since 1774, Washington believed an important line had been crossed and war had become a probability. Once the members of the Congress also realized that they were facing a military as well as a political crisis, the selection of Washington as the commander of the military was a foregone conclusion. The appointment of a Virginian was politically essential in order to assure the allegiance of the most populous and wealthiest colony to the cause, and at 6 feet 3 inches tall, Washington satisfied the requirements visually as well as politically more than anyone else. He just needed convincing that the summons came from the outside rather than from inside his own soul's unconscious ambitions. Though a battle-tested veteran, he had never actually commanded any unit larger than a regiment before. Washington was a rank amateur. His misgivings were not affectations of false humility, but rather realistic assessments during an intense moment of self-evaluation. The prospects of 13 disparate and contentious colonies defeating the most powerful army and navy in the world were remote in the extreme. But on July 3, 1775, he assumed command of 16,000 militia outside of Boston, the 21st anniversary of his ignominious defeat at Fort Necessity. This time he could not afford to lose. Chapter 3: First in War. Washington spent the entire American Revolutionary War in the field with the Continental Army. He was not by any standard a military genius. He lost more battles than he won. In fact, he lost more battles than any victorious general in modern history. Moreover, his defeats were frequently a function of his own overconfident and aggressive personality, especially during the early stages of the war. He was composed, indefatigable, and able to learn from his mistakes, and he was convinced that he was on the side of destiny. He was arrogant, he could not be bribed, corrupted, or compromised, and he apparently even believed that he could not be killed. For over 9 months, Washington's makeshift army managed to keep the more than 10,000 British troops bottled up in the city of Boston, after which point they just sailed away to Halifax. This marathon staring match exposed the anomaly that the Continental Congress had technically declared a war before it was even ready to declare American independence. On June 17, 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill, which technically took place at the nearby Breed's Hill, was a tactical victory for the British, but at the frightful cost of nearly half of their attacking force. 2 illusions were emerging. The first was the belief, held by both sides, that the conflict would be short, and the second was that militia volunteers fighting for principle made better soldiers than trained professionals. Washington became convinced that an army of short-term volunteers, no matter how dedicated they were to the cause, could not win the war. He wanted to model his troops after the British Army, which was richly ironic considering opposition to a standing formal army had been a major source of colonial protest during the pre-war years. He was brutally frank. The principles that led to the revolutionary spirit could only flourish if the war was won, and the war could only be won by a disciplined army of regulars. Washington began to be referred to as His Excellency, the salutation that inspired the name of the book that we are reviewing. He was the man who was once obsessed with control, and now he was designated the sovereign of the American Revolution. The man who could not bear to have his motives or personal integrity questioned was now assured that he enjoyed more trust than any American alive. He was discovering that his new public obligation to be all things to all men required him to suppress even the smallest residue of a private opinion. Washington was accompanied by his servant named Billy Lee at all times. Acutely aware of his own limited formal education, Washington selected college graduates who were his penman aides. The most trusted of these were Alexander Hamilton, Joseph Reed, and John Laurens, all of whom became like surrogate sons. His 4 chief lieutenants were Charles Lee, Horatio Gates, Nathaniel Greene, and Henry Knox. Lee and Gates were both former officers in the British Army with greater professional experience than Washington. Lee questioned Washington's preferred strategy of engaging British regulars on their own terms in a European-style war, as Lee preferred guerrilla tactics and a greater reliance on militia. Gates also favored a great reliance on militia and thought that Washington's plan for an assault on the British garrison in Boston was pure madness. Given his superior experience, Gates felt free to speak out for a more defensive strategy. Both Lee and Gates ended up colliding with Washington later in the war and became early exhibits of the fact that if you crossed Washington, you risked ruination. Greene and Knox were both inexperienced amateurs drawn to military service by their zeal for American independence. Nathaniel Greene, known as the Fighting Quaker, was cast out of the Society of Friends when he volunteered to serve in a local militia. He quickly ascended to brigadier within a year on the basis of his obvious intelligence and disciplined dedication. He demonstrated strategic and tactical brilliance that made him Washington's choice as a successor if Washington went down in battle. Knox was also a gifted amateur who demonstrated much resourcefulness and worshipped the ground that Washington walked on. From the very start, Washington made a point of insisting that his expansive mandate was dependent on and subordinate to the will of the American citizenry as represented in the Continental Congress. Just as the standing army he sought to create contradicted the political principles it claimed to be fighting for, Washington's king-like status contradicted the potent anti-monarchy ethos of the revolutionary ideology. He acknowledged the incongruity but preferred victory to consistency. The Continental Congress insisted that all recruits be volunteers and serve limited terms of no more than 1 year. This produced a military turnstile that fluctuated amateurs that came and went like tourists. Washington was perpetually frustrated with this practice. In desperation, he allowed for free black men to join his ranks, establishing the precedent for a racially integrated Continental Army, the only occasion in American military history when blacks and whites served alongside one another in integrated units until the Korean War. 2/3 of American casualties during the war were the result of disease, especially due to a smallpox epidemic. At any point in time, between 1/4 and 1/5 of Washington's army was unfit for duty. As the war dragged on, popular enthusiasm for the war faded along with the illusion that it would be a brief affair. The mythological rendition of dedicated citizen soldiers united for 8 long years in the fight for American liberty was, in fact, a romantic fiction designed by later generations to conceal the deep divisions and widespread apathy within the Patriot camp. The ingredients for a viable political solution to the imperial crisis were clearly present from 1774 and onward. as the Continental Congress continued to offer propositions for freedom from Parliament in exchange for continued economic membership in the British Empire. Their offers were consistently rejected because Great Britain was a newly arrived world power still learning how to manage its recently acquired empire. They feared what they called a domino theory, in which, if the American colonies were granted political autonomy over their domestic affairs, then Canada, Ireland, and the British Caribbean possessions would surely demand equivalent status, and the entire empire, including India, would gradually unravel. Britain remained convinced that the very future of the British Empire was at stake. The British Army enjoyed nearly total naval supremacy, which meant that all major American cities, Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston, were vulnerable. In any engagements along the coast or on coastal rivers, the British Army possessed superior mobility. The discipline and combat experience of British regulars gave them a decisive advantage on any battlefield where they were not greatly outnumbered. However, the British Army was an ocean away, which not only created problems of resupply, but also meant that they could ill afford to suffer heavy casualties, since replacements could not be produced easily or quickly. The British commanders were determined to identify and then destroy wherever the strategic center of the American rebellion was coming from. At first, they thought that the proper target was the corridor along the Hudson River, which, if controlled, could cut New England off from the middle and southern colonies. It turned out that the target they needed to identify and destroy was the Continental Army itself. Washington had multiple options available. First, he could take the Continental Army over the Alleghenies to avoid full-scale warfare in favor of hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. He could also fight what was known as a war of posts, meaning a series of tactical engagements and withdrawals designed to inflict casualties on the British Army but not risk his own troops. And thirdly, he could confront the British Army directly. Washington never gave the first option much consideration, as he considered this to be a desperate last result. His general Charles Lee favored this option, but Washington considered it a flight when he really wanted to fight. He maintained no faith whatsoever in the militia. He also considered the second option as a diluted form of cowardice. The third option was the most dangerous, but the most appealing personally, and Washington never hesitated. He prepared for a major engagement with the largest British force commanded by General William Howe. This bold decision came from his own personality, which welcomed the opportunity to demonstrate its contempt for British pretenses of supremacy. It would be difficult to imagine a more perfect place for the British Army to confront and crush the Continental Army than New York City. Once occupied, it sealed off New England from other rebellious colonies and was topographically made for the kind of amphibious operations that the British Navy excelled at. Long Island and Manhattan were hotbeds for Loyalists. On July 2nd and 3rd, 1776, Lord Howe's fleet began pouring troops onto Staten Island. In late May, Washington had traveled down to Philadelphia to consult with the Continental Congress about strategy. He planned to make a maximum effort to defend New York, and he created a Board of War and Ordnance with John Adams to facilitate coordination between Congress and the Army. Washington's orders reflected the revolutionary conviction that the purity of the cause, combined with sheer courage under fire, would more than compensate for inferior numbers and experience. However, the Americans suffered a humiliating defeat, and Long Island was lost in one day. By dividing his force between Manhattan and Long Island, Washington had presented Howe with the opportunity to destroy the Continental Army in small pieces. General Greene urged for a quick evacuation, advice that Washington rejected. Topography, British mobility, and Washington's own inexperience had combined to place the entire Continental Army at risk of complete annihilation. Washington remained committed to the offense and to victory. His decision to linger on Manhattan was militarily inexplicable and tactically suicidal. However, equally inexplicably, General Howe did not choose to close the trap around the Continental Army. Perhaps because Howe saw himself primarily as a peace negotiator instead of a war general, he occupied himself with capturing Fort Washington while the remnant of Washington's army made their escape across the Hudson and fled to New Jersey. Howe then proceeded to miss another opportunity to hunt down the crippled residue of the Continental Army as it limped across New Jersey. Due to the belief that armies should not fight during the winter, Howe chose to place his troops in winter quarters around Trenton, while Washington, meanwhile, was still thinking offensively. Washington launched a surprise attack on Christmas night across the Delaware River, a journey that he could not possibly have made standing in the prow of a boat, as the famous painting claims, for he would surely have been hurled headlong into the ice. He did personally lead the assault on Hessian soldiers who were exhausted from being on round-the-clock alert for over a week, expecting a continental attack. The Hessians fought bravely but were outgunned and suffered about 100 casualties, while the American casualties were minimal. Washington's plan had been excessively intricate. 3 of the 4 American units never even made it across the river, and he had been confronted with the decision to proceed with questionable resources or abandon the attack. This was an all-or-nothing wager, and this particular time he won it. Embarrassed at the unexpected defeat at Trenton, the British sent General Charles Cornwallis with a superior force to attack Washington's army encamped there. But Washington learned of the attack and quietly slipped away into the night, marching his 6,000 troops towards Princeton, where Cornwallis's rear guard was stationed. Again, the British were surprised, and this time a more conventional battle was fought. Although serious military damage was not inflicted on the British, Howe was forced to rethink his deployments, and the victories had a massive psychological effect on the American public opinion. What had appeared to be a lost cause now enjoyed a new lease on life. Washington now informed Congress that his only non-negotiable request was for a permanent standing army, and the Continental Congress granted his request for a temporary delegation of dictatorial power. Congress's own limited power over the states to fill the manpower quotas meant that these hopeful wishes would never come true. Washington's army, by January of 1777, probably only held about 3,000 recruits, and he felt obligated to conceal the real number lest the British realized that a winter campaign against him would surely end the war. While encamped at Morristown, Washington came to 2 important conclusions. First, he really must get a handle on the smallpox problem, and he set up special hospitals and made inoculation mandatory. Second, he began to accept the fact that he must adopt a more defensive strategy and fight that war of posts, which he considered the preferred approach of the weak. The Continental Army could not compete on equal terms with British regulars, but in all councils he held with his generals, especially Knox and Greene, he was continually reminded by them that preserving the Continental Army was the highest priority. In September of 1777, Washington was outmaneuvered at the Battle of Brandywine Creek. The British victory reinforced 2 unattractive facts. First, that the superior discipline of British regulars made them the masters of the battlefield, unless they were vastly outnumbered. And second, that Washington's inexperience at managing his force on a large battlefield beyond his visual control virtually guaranteed that he would be out-generaled by Howe. In October, a near victory for Washington at Germantown was transformed into a defeat when, amidst dense fog and smoke, American troops fired on each other, giving the British time to regroup. The decisive role they could play and the true value of militia was demonstrated when Washington sent his most trusted and battle-tested general, Benedict Arnold, along with Daniel Morgan's brigade of sharpshooters, to assist Horatio Gates at the Battle of Saratoga. Militia played effectively with regulars, and the stupendous success of Saratoga cast Gates into the heroic spotlight at the same time as a whispering campaign was being launched against Washington for his many failures. The clear lesson of Brandywine and Germantown was that the Continental Army was no match for Howe's regulars. Washington was finally forced to accept that this would be a lengthy war. He realized the completion of his transformation into a public figure whose personal convictions must be suppressed and rendered subordinate to his higher calling, winning a war, that was more important than just being himself. In December, Washington moved his army into winter quarters at Valley Forge. Chapter 4: Destiny's Child. American victory in the War for Independence became inevitable after General Howe missed his opportunity to destroy Washington's army in 1776, followed by the disastrous British defeat at Saratoga the following year, which prompted the French to enter the conflict on the American side. The decision by the British ministry to adopt a Southern strategy in 1778 to 1779 proved to be a futile effort, bogged down in the Carolina swamps after a series of tactical British victories that, thanks to the inspired leadership of Nathanael Greene, added up to a strategic defeat in a savage war of attrition. Eventually, Lord Cornwallis found his battered army marooned in the Yorktown Peninsula, where Washington, with the invaluable assistance of the French fleet, delivered the blow he had been dreaming about for 6 long years. When Washington had first taken his army into the winter quarters of Valley Forge, the Continental Congress lacked the authority to supply either money or men. Popular support for the war was declining, and few of the state governments were prepared to impose taxes on their residents or meet their enlistment quotas. The men shedding blood at Valley Forge came from the lowest rungs of American society: indentured servants, former slaves, landless sons, and recent immigrants. Most of them were very young. Most of them had signed on for the duration of the war, however long it may last, and in most cases they had no brighter prospects in life. Washington saluted their silent suffering at Valley Forge and recognized that he finally had the staying power that he had needed for the possibility of an eventual victory. The unpalatable and ironic truth was that the institutions that had alienated American colonists from the empire, Parliament's taxing power and a well-equipped standing army, gave the British a significant advantage in a protracted war. The War for Independence was only won by defying many of the values that the American Revolution claimed to stand for. 3 men destined to have an impact on Washington's career made their appearance around this time. John Marshall was a young lieutenant in Daniel Morgan's sharpshooters who ultimately wrote the definitive contemporary biography of Washington. The Marquis de Lafayette, a 19-year-old French nobleman, kept showing up and demanding to be made a general. His personal courage in battle and his willingness to serve at any rank endeared him to Washington, and his importance to Washington was deeply personal. Much like aides Hamilton and Laurens, Lafayette became a surrogate son to Washington. Heinrich Ferdinand Baron von Steuben, with a thorough knowledge of Prussian and French military procedures, had an infectious enthusiasm for drilling troops on the parade ground. The last official letter that Washington wrote as commander-in-chief was sent to Steuben, acknowledging that his contribution to American victory ranked near the top because it permitted the Continental Army to compete on equal terms with British regulars. One of the dominant themes in Washington's early life had been the elemental fact that success followed his survival. It's not clear how many men died of disease and exposure at Valley Forge, but new recruits and re-enlistments bolstered the size of his army to 12,000 by March in 1778, about 5,000 of which were battle-tested veterans. By May, the war was entering a new and perhaps climatic phase. General Howe had been replaced by Sir Henry Clinton. Clinton began to move his 10,000 troops out of Philadelphia towards New York, and Washington was torn between his urge to test his better-trained army in battle and his resolution to avoid any full-scale engagement that might destroy his army. Eventually, he chose a middle ground designed to harass without engaging in a major open-field fight. What became the battle at Monmouth Courthouse was unavoidable when Lafayette blundered directly into Clinton's main force. The troops of the Continental Army held the field at the end of the sweltering day and inflicted almost twice as many casualties on Clinton's regulars, and it was clear that the Continentals were now a match for British professionals and could hold its own in a conventional open field engagement. Victory in America seemed imminent. If the war for independence were a marathon, Washington's distinguishing virtue was his sheer stamina. However, his experience as commander-in-chief was less like a long-distance race and more like a roller coaster ride. The Iroquois Confederation, the Six Nations, had made the sensible but spectacularly misguided decision that America was destined to lose the war. Washington detailed instructions during the summer of 1779 for a merciless campaign that wholly destroyed about 20 Indian villages and towns. The Six Nations never recovered from this blow. While he was sending a detachment to the west, the British were sending a much larger force to the south. Many Americans had presumed that the triumph at Saratoga marked the beginning of the end. However, the British ministry had decided that Saratoga was merely the end of the beginning. The New York garrison was becoming a launching site for a full-scale campaign in the Carolinas. Washington, meanwhile, was becoming completely frustrated and hand-tied by the Continental Congress. Failure of political leadership at the national level, which had permitted inflation, corruptions, and broken promises, meant that sheer indifference had become a more formidable enemy than the whole force of Great Britain. The problem was not a lack of will, but a deep-rooted suspicion of government power that severely limited the authority of the Continental Congress. Congress had made itself vulnerable to the same criticisms that the colonies had directed at Parliament itself. The Articles of Confederation, adopted officially in 1781, accurately embodied the same one-vote principle and did not create a unified American nation, but rather a confederation of sovereign states. Washington began sending routine circulars to the states requesting money, supplies, and fresh recruits. By 1780, his desperation pushed him over the edge as he became an outspoken advocate for expanded powers at the national level. He was forced to order a general confiscation of cattle and grain from the local farmers, noting that his choice was between stealing or starving, plundering instead of protecting. Two major British victories occurred in the South. First, Charleston fell victim to the British Navy and over 5,000 Americans were taken prisoners. Then Gates's army was completely routed at Camden. Washington sent Greene south to take charge of the surviving remnants of the Southern Army and replace Gates, but he confessed that he thought this was a forlorn hope and near certain death. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold had for several months been negotiating with the British for a substantial bribe in exchange for delivering West Point into their hands. Arnold seemed to symbolize the crumbling of an ideal and the collapse of the American cause. In January of 1781, 1,000 troops from Pennsylvania, who had not been paid in over a year and who had no clothes to survive the winter, marched on the Continental Congress brandishing weapons. 2 officers who attempted to stop them were shot down. A second mutiny occurred 3 weeks later in New Jersey. This was the lowest dip in Washington's roller coaster ride. The British Army was victorious over the South, the Continental Army was on the verge of dissolution in the North, and the Continental Congress seemed to be powerless to reverse the course by providing revenue. Fortunes began to turn when, miraculously, in April of 1781, after 5 years of haggling, the states finally managed to ratify the Articles of Confederation, thereby providing a constitutional foundation for the new entity calling itself the United States of America. The establishment of a new frame of government did permit long overdue administrative reform and created secretaries of finance, war, and foreign affairs that would provide greater coherence in managing the war effort. A French army of 6,000 troops, commanded by Count Rochambeau, remained encamped at Newport and corresponded with Washington to negotiate its deployment. Rochambeau refused to commit his troops as long as British ships still controlled the Atlantic, but he did agree to move his troops overland to link up with Washington outside of British-occupied New York. In the South, Daniel Morgan's riflemen had combined with local militia to inflict a stunning defeat on Cornwallis's troops at Cowpens. Greene, though vastly outnumbered, was working his magic, inflicting heavy losses with his hit-and-run tactics in what was later described as the most brilliantly conducted campaign of the war. Benedict Arnold became a British general in Virginia and was running amok over an almost defenseless countryside, so Washington sent 2,000 troops under Lafayette to counter the British campaign in Virginia. However, Cornwallis's troops were steadily marching north through North Carolina, headed to reinforce Virginia. By the early summer of 1781, Washington believed that the resources of the country were exhausted and the Continental Army was on the verge of extinction. He remained obsessed with New York and resisted pressure from South Carolina and Virginia to take his army south. He knew that America needed a decisive victory, and he continued to believe recapturing New York would provide it. Washington's subsequent distortion of the historical record was designed to make the Yorktown victory a possibility that he had foreseen early on, whereas his contemporary personal correspondence reveals that New York had dominated his mind's eye for so long. He only gave it up gradually and grudgingly. Rochambeau was not ever going to send his French fleet to destruction at New York. In fact, he had ordered that they sail no further north than the Chesapeake Bay. Once Washington finally shifted his focus from New York to the south, he never looked back. In August, Cornwallis moved his entire army of more than 7,000 troops onto the Tidewater Peninsula at Yorktown. Washington sent 2,000 troops to join Lafayette and block Cornwallis's escape route off of the peninsula. When the French fleet appeared, Cornwallis realized his predicament and the Yorktown trap was sealed. The climatic battle that Washington had dreamed of for 6 long years was finally at hand. The Yorktown siege was an exercise in engineering which happened to be one of the Continental Army's weaknesses, but fortunately the French army included the best engineers in the world. In fact, the entire siege was primarily a French operation. Cornwallis acknowledged the inevitable on October 17th, requesting a meeting to settle the terms of surrender. Washington had only negotiated one surrender before in his life, and that was his own at Fort Necessity 27 years prior. The most consequential battle in American history, the decisive battle that Washington had been questing for 6 years, had just been won. And yet Washington did not even understand yet that the war was over. For months, Washington wrote letters to everyone who would listen that the British ministry would respond to Yorktown the same way that they had responded to Saratoga. He refused to believe reports from London and Paris that British negotiators recognized that they had lost their American empire. He urged the Congress to order him to resume the offensive, perhaps against Charleston, or even better, against New York. He insisted on maintaining his army in a state of readiness until the peace treaty in which the British officially acknowledged American independence was signed. The term negotiations troubled him. What was there to negotiate? He wanted his vaunted superiors to admit that they were his inferiors. He kept drilling the Continental Army to new levels of military discipline just in case the diplomatic effort collapsed and war resumed. Ironically, the Continental Army was probably best prepared to fight when fighting was no longer necessary. In March of 1783, the threat of a military coup as a political weapon to expand the powers of the Confederation Congress over the states led to a split within the officers' corps. Moderates like Henry Knox threatened the coup, and radicals like Horatio Gates threatened a military takeover of the government. Washington made himself synonymous with the American Revolution in order to declare that it was incompatible with dictatorial power. He declared that he had sufficient control over his ambitions to recognize that his place in history would be enhanced not by enlarging his power, but by surrendering it. He understood the principle of republicanism, that all legitimate power is derived from the consent of the public, and he did not agree with versions of republicanism that emphasized the elimination of executive power altogether. King George III was heard to say that, if after this great victory and surrender, if Washington resisted assuming a monarchical mantle and retired from power, as he had always said he intended to, he would be the greatest man in the world. There were two dramatic farewell scenes between Washington and the army. First in Newburgh in November 1783, soon after word arrived from Paris that the definitive version of the peace treaty had been signed, Washington said goodbye to the ordinary soldiers in an emotional ceremony in which he addressed them as one patriotic band of brothers. He expressed his hope that the states would honor their obligation to fund the promised pensions, and he urged all the soldiers to return to their homes as citizens of the United States, rather than as Virginians or New Englanders. A final farewell occurred in Annapolis in December, where Washington toasted at the dinner with a criticism of the limited powers provided by the Articles of Confederation. "Having now finished the work assigned me," he said, "I retire from the great theater of action. I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the enjoyments of public life. It was considered the greatest exit in American history." Chapter 5. Introspective Interlude. Nothing would ever be the same again. Before the war, Washington's reputation was regional rather than national, and rested primarily on the wealth he had inherited with Martha's dowry and in part from his service during the French and Indian War. After Yorktown, his preeminence was international and rested on the purity of his revolutionary credentials, a nearly inexhaustible reservoir of conferred grace akin to canonization. Sculptors, painters, chroniclers, and sheer gawkers descended on Mount Vernon. During this interlude between the war and his presidency, when Washington seemed to believe he had completely retired from public duty, he seemed to have a growing recognition that his time on earth was running out. The deaths of several younger comrades, John Laurens, Nathaniel Greene, and Charles Lee, intensified his fatalistic mood. He firmly believed his public career was over, and his life nearly so, but this period of time turned out to be only a brief retirement, an interlude rather than an epilogue. Washington continued to believe that only a more powerful central government could secure the gains made by the American Revolution, but by now only a major crisis could make that happen. Most of the prominent leaders of the revolutionary generation recognized that they were making history and took care to preserve their correspondence and edit their memoirs with an eye towards posterity's judgment. Washington's posterity project had started towards the end of the war, when he had persuaded Congress to fund a team of secretaries to transcribe his entire wartime correspondence. He hoped to avoid interviews about his personal life by referring the countless chroniclers to the official wartime correspondence, thereby protecting his privacy and avoiding even the appearance of self-promotion. But about a year into his retirement, he concluded that he was being hounded into an early grave by correspondence. Every letter that he signed was likely being preserved, copied, and cataloged, and would eventually contribute to the Washington legacy. He was not just writing to his friends and contemporaries, he was writing to posterity. Washington devoted considerable attention and energy during his retirement years, trying to transform his Potomac dream into a reality. In the 1780s, he worried that the Confederation Congress was too distracted and divided by local interests to effectively manage Western expansion. The most menacing Western culprit in his mind was Great Britain, whose troops remained stationed on the frontier in violation of the Treaty of Paris, surely hoping to recover some portion of the empire they had lost at Yorktown. Washington himself owned nearly 60,000 acres of land in the Shenandoah Valley, western Pennsylvania, and tracts on the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, and those properties had become his chief source of revenue in the form of rental fees. He knew that land represented the only tangible and abiding measure of his hard-won status and his only form of financial security. In September of 1784, he toured his western holdings and came upon several families who had settled on plots he owned. Washington hired a lawyer to evict them if they refused to leave or pay him rent as tenants. He won the court case, but his victory did nothing to embellish his reputation for soaring majestically above his own private interests. Instead of the Jeffersonian model of independent farming, Washington opted for the Fairfax model of tenants and control, a choice he calculated to slow westward migration since no settler would willingly opt to rent land rather than to own. Washington's mind was haunted by memories of his landless Virginia youth and was stuck in the hierarchical presumptions of that era. A political firestorm broke out over Washington's membership in the Society of the Cincinnati, which was an elitist enterprise designed to sustain the aristocratic ethos of superior virtue that officers in the Continental Army had been harboring since Valley Forge. Washington believed that the American Revolution had destroyed monarchy and the British imperial rule, and in that sense it was a significant political revolution. But he did not believe that it was also a social revolution that destroyed the world of privilege, rank, and deference. For him, the Society of the Cincinnati did not defy the best ideals of the American Revolution, it embodied them. Members of the society were widely regarded as an aspiring American nobility, and ultimately Washington changed his mind about lending his prestige to its purposes. However, the society continued to elect Washington as its president, despite his best efforts to maintain a discreet distance from their meetings. The society became a kind of albatross, permanently tied to Washington's neck. The accusations leveled at the society provided a preview of the ideological battles designed to engulf Washington during his second term as president. In December of 1785, Washington received an ominous letter from a Quaker designed to strike him in his most vulnerable spot. The letter intimated that if Washington acted decisively at this very moment by freeing all of his slaves, it would crown his career and assure his place in history. But if he faltered, the failure would haunt his reputation forever. Washington did not answer the letter. He was not accustomed to being the butt of lectures, most especially from Quakers, whose pristine consciences had obliged them to sit out the war as spectators. However, the letter was more than an irritation. It linked the subject Washington cared about the most, his reputation and posterity's judgment, with the subject he had come to recognize as the central contradiction of the Revolutionary era. There is considerable evidence that slavery was very much on Washington's mind during his first retirement, and ideas were swirling through his head, following two separate lines of thought. One line of thought was initially prompted by the circumstances of war. Washington had grudgingly accepted free blacks into the Continental Army in 1775, then had commanded a racially integrated force for nearly 8 years. This exposed him to a range of racial relationships that he had never encountered as the master at Mount Vernon before. Lafayette prompted Washington to acknowledge that ending slavery was a logical outcome of the American Revolution. However, after Yorktown and the British evacuation of New York, Washington had insisted on the return of all escaped slaves in British custody to their respective owners. He came to understand that he supported a more gradual method of emancipation and wrote that it was among his wishes to see some plan adopted by legislature in which slavery may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. The second line of thought focused on slavery not as a national institution, but at Mount Vernon. Washington told his manager that he intended to abandon slave labor and replace the slaves at Mount Vernon with hired workers. He made no mention of moral or ideological motives, and his conviction was rooted in the fact that slave labor was more inefficient and costly than hired labor. He gradually concluded that the cost of maintaining a slave labor force became prohibitively expensive, and because he owned more slaves than he could possibly employ, the surplus was costing him dearly. At this point, he was considering selling his slaves into bondage to others, not freeing them, and his focus was on realistic calculations about profit and loss. However, Washington did not go through with the decision to sell off his slaves. It gradually dawned on him that any scheme for selling the slaves encountered three overlapping difficulties that imposed an intractable dilemma. First, the dower slaves inherited from the Custis estate did not legally belong to him and therefore were not his to sell. Second, the eldest slaves that he had acquired decades prior were now beyond their prime years and therefore would be impossible to sell. And third, the multiple connections by blood and marriage within the slave population at Mount Vernon virtually precluded any general sale once Washington had resolved not to break up families. He and his black workforce were ultimately trapped together in a network of mutual dependency that was spiraling downward toward economic ruin. Eventually, he resolved to never again purchase another slave, and he accepted that Mount Vernon would never turn a profit because it had become a retirement home and child care center for many of his slave residents, whom he was morally obligated to care for. Much of what he grew on his farms would never reach the marketplace, but instead would be consumed on the grounds by his black laborers and their families. If he could not sell them, Washington chose to make the maintenance of slave families a higher priority than turning a profit with his land. He saw this as a moral posture and a small price for the troubled conscience to pay for a measure of solace. During the war, Washington had learned the hard way that depending on a virtuous citizenry was futile. Making voluntary sacrifice was the operative principle of Republican government had proved to be a romantic delusion. He made no secret of his contempt for the Confederation Congress, which he described as wretchedly flawed, and his conviction that the Articles of Confederation were fatally flawed. The core meaning of the Spirit of '76 was an instinctive aversion to coercive political power of any sort, most especially centralized power emanating from any distant location beyond the surveillance of the citizens it affected. But the fear that haunted Washington was not one of excessive federal power reminiscent of Parliament, but rather that of a weak confederation reminiscent of the Continental Congress's woefully inadequate performance during the war. He knew that the French and Indian War was a competition among three imperial powers, Great Britain, France, and the Six Nations, for domination of North America east of the Mississippi. The removal of Great Britain and the replacement of the United States meant that this country would have some weight in the scale of empires, and the strategic stakes were huge. The stakes could only be achieved by a federal government fully empowered to harness and manage the enormous energies and resources involved in such a large-scale imperial project. John Jay informed Washington of conversations for a general convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. A year-long negotiation ended with Washington attending and chairing the Constitutional Convention, and then becoming the unanimous selection as the first President of the United States. He performed a political dance in which he pretended to shy away from all invitations and overtures to resume his public career, remembering that in 1783 he had promised to leave behind public life forever, and also unwilling to risk his reputation in a venture he could not guarantee would be successful. By March of 1787, a roster of state delegations revealed an impressive array of talent that intended to thoroughly transform the political system. Washington knew that the Articles must be thoroughly replaced rather than revised, and that the new government needed to possess expanded powers sufficient to make laws for the nation as a whole. The conclusion in Philadelphia was a federal government comprised of three separate branches: executive, judicial, and legislative. Washington was simultaneously the most important person at the convention and the least involved in the shaping of the document that emerged. His mere presence lent an air of legitimacy to the proceedings. The Great Compromise resolved the impasse over representation by making it proportional to population in the lower house and by state in the Senate. Ratification in late summer of 1788 carried him inexorably into the presidency. Chapter 6. First in Peace. There was no such thing as a viable American nation when Washington took over office as president. The roughly 4 million settlers spread along the coastline and streaming over the mountains felt their primary allegiance was to local, state, and regional authorities. No Republican government had ever before exercised control over a population this diffuse or a landmass this large. Washington's core achievement as president, much as it had been when he commanded the Continental Army, was to transform the improbable into the inevitable. Assessments of Washington's presidency tend to be forward-looking, understandably concerned with the constitutional precedents he set for the executive branch in such specific areas as the cabinet system, control over foreign policy, the veto, executive appointments, and setting the legislative agenda. But any comprehensive appraisal of his legacy must also look backwards on the highly problematic attitude towards executive power that pervaded the political culture when he took office. Everything Washington did set a precedent. The ground on which an American president stood was untrodden, and the air around it was filled with menacing memories of King George III. In fact, the specter of monarchy haunted Washington's entire presidency, especially during his second term, when murmurings became full-fledged attacks on both his policies and his character and affected him more deeply than any criticism he had received during the war. He was ill-equipped to handle the partisanship that came to define the political culture of the 1790s, and he found himself in the ironic position of being the indispensable man in a political world that regarded all men as disposable. Without him to center it, the political experiment in republicanism might very well have failed. Only his correspondence with Mount Vernon allowed him to retain a zone of personal control amidst an increasingly discordant political world. Not much happened at the executive level during the first year of Washington's presidency. His official correspondence was dominated by job applications, all of which received the same Republican response. Merit rather than favoritism must determine all federal appointments. He did honor his pledge to visit all the states in the Union. In the fall of 1789, he launched a month-long tour of New England and conducted his southern tour during the spring of 1791, accompanied by his favorite greyhound, mischievously named Cornwallis. The very idea of a Republican chief executive was a novelty, so there was no available vocabulary to characterize such a creature except by the verbal traditions surrounding European courts and kings. Exercising executive authority called for a completely different set of leadership skills than symbolizing it. Washington made himself the hub of the wheel, with routine business delegated to the department heads at the rim. He identified and recruited talented and ambitious young men, usually possessing superior formal education to his own, and he trusted them with considerable responsibility and treated them as surrogate sons in his official family. James Madison, co-author of the Federalist Papers, became his most trusted consultant on judicial and executive appointments and his unofficial liaison with Congress. Madison showed Washington his draft of 12 amendments to the Constitution, 10 of which became immortalized as the Bill of Rights. Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, merited by a nearly spotless revolutionary experience and 5 years of diplomatic experience in Paris. Alexander Hamilton was probably the brightest of the lot and had served as Washington's aide-de-camp during the war. Hamilton's loyalty to Washington was unquestioned, and he made himself the chief advocate for fiscal reform, an energetic national government, and Secretary of Treasury. Henry Knox became Secretary of War. John Jay provided the distinguished legal and political mindset to the mix, and the first Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. Washington chose to delegate nearly complete control and boundless trust to these men and maintained a discreet distance to avoid comparison with monarchical powers. In February 1790, Benjamin Franklin invested his great prestige to force the public discussion over slavery on the national level at Congress. Washington shared Franklin's views on slavery, and they both favored some kind of gradual emancipation scheme. However, Washington refused to commit himself on the grounds that the matter was properly the responsibility of Congress to debate, and ultimately Washington endorsed Madison's maneuvering in the House, which voted to prohibit any further consideration of ending the slave trade until 1808. Madison managed to take slavery off the national agenda, which in the eyes of the 21st century appears to be a grave failure of moral leadership. However, Washington did not appear to struggle with this decision. Whatever his views on slavery were, His highest public priority was the creation of a unified American nation. He was convinced that slavery was the one issue with the political potential to destroy the Republican experiment in its infancy. In Washington's opinion, the moratorium on discussion further should last until at least 1808, giving the nation a chance to develop and unite in its cradle before a discussion so controversial and combustible was brought forward again. Washington gave total responsibility for rescuing the debt-burdened American economy to his charismatic Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton created a national economic policy that presumed sovereign power of the federal government, leaving no doubt that control over fiscal policy would not be brokered to accommodate the states. The political bombshell was described as a hostile takeover of the American Revolution by industrial Northern bankers and speculators. Although Washington played no public role in defending or supporting Hamilton's program, he was just as much of an economic nationalist as Hamilton was. Washington managed to levitate above the political landscape, partly because of his aloof personality, and partly as an effort to maintain the presidency far removed from edgy partisan battles. In only 3 policy areas did he abandon levitation or delegation. These areas were the location of the national capital, foreign policy, and Indian affairs. Madison led the fight for a Potomac location of the national capital, arguing that the geographic midpoint of the nation on a north-south axis was not just the mouth of the Potomac, but Mount Vernon itself. The Residency Act passed in July 1790, designating the Potomac location of what we now know of as Washington, D.C. today. Pierre L'Enfant was hired as chief architect, and he produced a grandiose vision of a massive city that would eventually fill up with citizens. Washington approved the sites for the presidential mansion and the Capitol, and chose architects who designed them. He treated the national capital as a public version of his Mount Vernon plantation, and he made regular visits from his home to monitor progress. Jefferson and Madison, also regular visitors to the site of the new capital, regarded the Potomac location as a guarantee of Virginia's abiding harmony within the Union. Washington was thinking even more expansively, hoping to establish a national university within the new capital to recruit and educate the brightest young men from all regions to congregate and share a common American experience and shape the future of the government. Washington was a thoroughgoing realist. He believed that the behavior of nations was not driven by ideals but by interests. This put him at odds with Jefferson, who believed that American ideals were American interests. Jefferson had witnessed the French Revolution and thought that the United States had a moral obligation to support it, while Washington knew better than anyone that victory over Great Britain would have been impossible without French economic and military assistance. Washington was determined to prevent his personal affection for Lafayette and his warm memories of Rochambeau and his soldiers from influencing his judgment about the long-term foreign interests of the United States. He believed the interests of the new nation did not lie across the Atlantic Ocean, but west of the Alleghenies in the forests and fields he had explored as a young man. The chief task was to consolidate control of the continent east of the Mississippi, a view shared by Jefferson. In fact, during his presidency, Jefferson would do more than anyone else to expand those visions. Governor Morris, appointed as the American minister to France, corresponded that the American Revolution had been guided by experience and light, while the French Revolution was obsessed with experiments and lightning. A potential crisis surfaced in the summer of 1790 when the British appeared poised to launch an invasion from Canada down the Mississippi and replace Spain as the dominant European power in the American West. The prospect of another major war with Great Britain was daunting. Fortunately, the crisis fizzled when the British decided to back off, but 2 facts became clear. First, that Washington was resolved to avoid war at almost any cost, convinced that the fragile American Republic was neither militarily nor economically capable of confronting the British Leviathan at this time. Second was that Hamilton's assessment, not Jefferson's, was more closely aligned with his own. Strictly speaking, the federal government's relations with the Native American tribes was also a foreign policy matter. From the start, Indian affairs came under the authority of the Secretary of War. However, for both personal and policy reasons, Washington wanted his own hand firmly on this particular tiller. He regarded the final fate of the Indian inhabitants as an important piece of unfinished business that must not be allowed to end on a tragic note. Knox estimated that there were about 76,000 Native Americans living in the region, about 20,000 of which were seasoned warriors, and tribal chiefs like Corn Planter and Joseph Brant deserved cultivation as allies rather than as heads of state. Washington had experienced Indian power firsthand, and he did not view them as exotic savages, but rather as familiar and formidable adversaries who fought for their own independence, in effect behaving pretty much the same as he would do in their place. Moreover, the letters that he received from several tribal chiefs provided poignant testimony that they now regarded him as their personal protector, and such pleas did not fall on deaf ears. Working closely with Knox, Washington devised a policy designed to create several sovereign Indian homelands and concurred with Knox that the independent tribes of Indians ought to be considered as foreign nations, not as the subjects of any particular state. Treaties with these tribes should be regarded as binding contracts sanctioned by the federal government. He wrote, "Indians, being the prior occupants, possess the right of the soil. To dispossess them would be a gross violation of the fundamental laws of nature and of justice, which is the glory of this nation. A more coercive policy of outright confiscation would constitute a moral failure that would stain the character of the nation." Washington sought to avoid the outcome of Indian removal that ultimately occurred 40 years later under Andrew Jackson. Instead, he envisioned multiple sanctuaries under tribal control that would be bypassed by the surging wave of white settlers, and whose occupants would gradually, over the course of the next century, become assimilated as full-fledged American citizens. Success depended on identifying key tribal leaders willing to negotiate and capable of imposing the settlement on other tribes in the region. In the summer of 1790, Washington hosted Alexander McGillivray, a charismatic Creek chief, and 26 other chiefs for several weeks of official dinners, parades, and diplomatic ceremonies. The chiefs made their mark on the Treaty of New York, redrawing the borders for a sovereign Creek nation. Washington reinforced the terms of the treaty by issuing the Proclamation of 1790, an executive order forbidding private or state encroachments on all Indian lands guaranteed by the treaty with the United States. But Washington soon found it was one thing to proclaim and quite another to sustain. The Georgia legislature defied the proclamation by selling more than 15 million acres to speculators, rendering the Treaty of New York worthless. No equivalent of McGillivray could be found among the 6 Iroquois nations who had been virtually destroyed in the War for Independence. Washington was forced to approve a series of military expeditions into the Ohio Valley to put down uprising by the Miami, Wyandot, and Shawnee, even though he believed the chief culprits were white vigilante groups determined to provoke hostilities. He complained that the Indian side of the story, whatever really happened in their eyes, would never make it into the history books because the Indians had no printing press or any ability to publish their account into the public. He said when only one side of the story is heard and often repeated, the human mind becomes impressed with it insensibly. This particular quote from Washington reminded me starkly of what Adolf Hitler said 150 years later. Eventually, Washington was forced to acknowledge that his vision of secure Indian sanctuaries could not be enforced. It was a logical, economic, and political impossibility. If an accommodation with the Native American populations were the major preoccupation of his first term as president, it was also his singular failure. By 1792, Washington had demonstrated many of the same leadership skills in the political arena that he had previously displayed as commander-in-chief during the war. He had avoided political battles that threatened to push federal sovereignty further and faster than public opinion allowed, much as he had avoided combat that threatened to annihilate the Continental Army. And, just as he had delegated crucial military campaigns to Nathanael Greene, He now delegated control of fiscal reform to Alexander Hamilton. The one and only major battle he had chosen to lead personally was the challenge for federal jurisdiction over Indian affairs, a battle which he predictably lost. His heartfelt intention was to retire at the end of this term. Several spirited conversations between Jefferson and Hamilton exposed the widening chasm within his official family. The hatred between the two men had become palpable, mutual, and personal. It had been simmering for over a year, and only the patriarchal dominance of Washington's personality had prevented an explosion. Although no one knew it at the time, political parties were in the process of being born. The split between Jefferson and Hamilton was destined to foster the creation of a two-party system as the central feature in the American political universe. It eventually became clear that a two-party system was a major contribution to modern political science, for by forcing the wide spectrum of political opinions into two camps, it institutionalized the ongoing dialogue into an organized format that routinized dissent. But what is seen today as a great contribution was regarded by its creators as a great curse. The Republican Party began in Virginia during the spring and summer of 1790. The lengthy debate in the House over slavery startled most Virginia planters. The mere suggestion that the federal government could legislate slavery out of existence generated panic among the Tidewater elite. Hamilton's financial program signaled the triumph of Northern commerce, and Virginians believed they were witnessing the emergence of a federal government moving in a direction hostile to their economic interest. James Madison led the fight in Congress against both federal jurisdiction over slavery and the entire Hamiltonian fiscal program, and Thomas Jefferson soon joined him. Together, they launched an orchestrated attack on the administration that they were officially serving, castigating Washington's policy of neutrality as a vile repudiation of America's obligations to France. Madison described the aggregation of power by the federal government as an ominous second coming on American soil of the British monster that the Revolution had supposedly banished forever. He decried Hamilton's program as a homemade version of the Stamp Act and the federal government as an imperial power that treated the states as mere colonies. The genius of his formulation was that it transformed a regional or sectional grievance rooted in economic interest into a patriotic rallying cry rooted in a rhetoric with all the hallowed echoes of 1776. Washington was immune to the virulent anti-government stain of revolutionary ideology that Jefferson and Madison were deploying because he had witnessed its consequences firsthand as commander-in-chief. The Continental Army had nearly starved to death, and the war itself had been prolonged and nearly lost, all for lack of a viable central government empowered to raise money and troops. He believed that independence required a fully empowered federal government. Furthermore, if one wished to talk about a hostile takeover of the American Revolution, he believed the chief culprits were those very Virginians, most of whom had never fired a shot during the war, and who were now trying to rewrite history in order to preserve their fading status and privileges. Instead of regarding Jefferson as the serpent in the garden, Washington preferred to see him as a prodigal son who would eventually realize the error of his ways and return to the bosom of his family. Washington's confidence in both the correctness of his political vision and the strength of his dominating personal presence made him impervious to gossip about Jefferson's duplicity. He continued to meet with Jefferson and rely on advice from both Jefferson and Madison. But whenever Washington unburdened himself in private conversations with Jefferson or Madison about his personal fatigue, his declining energy, or his insatiable urge for retirement at Mount Vernon, they recorded their recollections of the conversations as evidence of his growing mental detachment from the duties of office. They convinced themselves that the aging patriarch was not really in charge or fully responsible for the policies going forward under the protection of his own name, and they believed that the satanic presence and true power behind the scene was Alexander Hamilton. As late as November of that year, with the next presidential election imminent, Washington continued to cling to the illusion that he still had a choice in the matter, but once again the electoral vote was unanimous. Washington's second inaugural address reflects his mood. It was the briefest in presidential history, only 2 paragraphs long. Washington's second term as president began as pure purgatory, with events seeming to tumble straight towards hell. McGilvary's stabilizing influence eroded under Spanish prodding and bribes, producing violent clashes with white settlers from Kentucky to Florida. The Six Nations tried but failed to exercise control over the Ohio tribes, whose leaders declared war on any person of white skin who entered what they called their island. The French Revolution moved from liberty, equality, and fraternity to the guillotine, and Lafayette, fleeing the chaos, was captured and placed in an Australian dungeon. Farmers in western Pennsylvania staged mass protests, forcing the government to take up makeshift quarters in Germantown. And the battle within the cabinet between Jefferson and Hamilton escalated, ending only at the end of the year when Jefferson took his wounds and his principles back home to Monticello in retirement. Washington's favorite nephew died of tuberculosis, and Washington himself had a cancer-like growth that required a debilitating surgery. Hamilton remained the chief villain in Republican editorials, but Washington himself became targeted as either a senile accomplice or a willing co-conspirator in Hamilton's plot to establish an American monarchy. In 1793, war broke out between Great Britain and revolutionary France. Washington convened a cabinet to draft a policy of strict American neutrality. A minister from France arrived promptly, brimming over with assurance that there would be no such thing as neutrality when the cause of liberty was on the march. Jefferson confirmed that the American and French revolutions were more powerful than any presidential proclamation, but the minister's flurry of unrealistic demands doomed his missions. Even Jefferson was forced to dismiss him as an albatross, despite the fact that the cause of France was wildly popular with the American public. Washington was absolutely certain that America's long-term interest was best served by steering a neutral course that avoided war with any of the European powers. He was equally convinced that his Republican opponents were manipulating popular opinion towards France as a political weapon. In 1791, Congress passed an excise tax on whiskey to help pay the debt created by Hamilton's program. A defiant collection of aggrieved farmers, emboldened by their conditions that the excise tax was every bit as illegitimate as the taxes levied by the British ministry, diametrically opposed Washington and his federalized troops, an updated version of the Continental Army, who marched west to enforce the authority of the constitutionally elected government that claimed to represent all people. The clash was later described as the Spirit of 76 against the Spirit of 87, with Washington in the saddle as commander and Hamilton by his side. This was the first and only time a sitting American president has ever led troops in a field. The bravado of the rebels evaporated at the approach of the formidable force, and Washington offered amnesty to all the rebels who signed an oath to obey the laws of the federal government. He did not dispute the right of aggrieved citizens to dissent, but he insisted that dissent could not take the form of flagrant violation of federal authority. The greatest crisis of Washington's presidency was the debate over the Jay Treaty. By 1794, the prospects of war with Great Britain were approaching a crisis. In defiance of the Treaty of Paris, British troops remained stationed on the northwestern frontier, justified as a strategic response to America's refusal to compensate British creditors for pre-revolutionary debts. Merely as a symbol, the British military presence suggested a hovering reminder that American victory in the war was still incomplete. More substantially, British troops were encouraging the Ohio tribes to defy Washington's efforts at accommodation. The outbreak of war between Britain and France had escalated the tensions, in part because the sentiments of the American citizenry were decidedly pro-French, and in part because British cruisers were scooping up American merchant vessels in the Caribbean in an effort to block all trade with France. In April of 1794, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a realistic bargain that would remove the British troops and redefine commercial relations with Britain in terms that avoided having a war. These were sensible and far-sighted goals, but at the time the very thought of negotiating with the British was wildly unpopular with the public. Jay was known to favor repayment of the long-standing debts to British creditors, debts that Virginians preferred to ignore. The terms that John Jay were able to negotiate only made matters worse. The treaty he obtained required for the removal of British troops from the frontier, and it committed the British to arbitrate American claims of compensation for cargoes confiscated by their navy. But otherwise, the terms were decidedly unfavorable. They accepted British economic and naval supremacy in language that implied that American neutrality in the current crisis with France had a decidedly British tilt. The treaty created a neo-colonial status for the United States within the British Empire. The Republican press had a field day as soon as the treaty terms were made public. Jay claimed he could have walked the entire eastern seaboard at night and had his way illuminated by protesters burning him in effigy. Washington personally believed that Jay had probably negotiated for the best terms possible. And while it was not all that he had hoped for, the treaty did avert a popular but misguided war and preserved economic relations with America's major trading power. Despite major opposition, Washington signed the treaty. Thomas Jefferson could not believe that a treaty so wildly unpopular could ever be signed into law. He persuaded himself that the true meaning of the Constitution gave the House of Representatives sovereign power over all legislation, including the power to make and sign treaties with foreign powers. In Jefferson's opinion, Washington remained a marvelously well-intentioned but quasi-senile frontman for a Federalist conspiracy, and had inadvertently lent his enormous credibility to the treacheries being hatched all around him. Washington described the Jay Treaty as a blatantly partisan effort masquerading as a noble cause, and he confessed to Jay that the vicious personal attacks and willful misrepresentations that dominated the debate were ominous signs of a new kind of party politics for which he had no stomach. The debate over the Jay Treaty exposed the major fault line running through the entire Revolutionary era. On one side stood those who wished America's revolutionary energies to be harnessed to the larger purposes of nation building. On the other stood those who interpreted that very process as a betrayal of the Revolution itself. Washington did not try to straddle that divide in the Jay Treaty debate or delegate the frontline position in the battle to surrogates. Just as he had at Trenton and Princeton during the war, he took the lead. But he was wounded in the battle, struck in the spot that he cared about most passionately, his reputation. The partisan character of the debate over the Jay Treaty rendered all claims to transcendence above party politics obsolete. Washington could neither accept that fact nor ignore the wounds that this new form of politics had inflicted on him and on his legacy. Another painful wound that he felt personally was Jefferson's betrayal. Jefferson had taken care to assure that his own fingerprints were never left on any public documents, but his private correspondence revealed his true opinions on Washington. At some level, Washington knew that Jefferson was orchestrating the Republican campaign against his presidency, but on another level, Jefferson remained one of his most cherished surrogate sons, prodigal but surely misguided. Although exposed, Jefferson wrote to Washington to assure him that he had played no direct role in the recent press attacks against Washington's character. Historians have always had a difficult time trying to pinpoint the moment when the party system displaced a government founded on trust and bipartisan assumptions. For Washington, this was that moment. Washington asked his other surrogate son, Alexander Hamilton, to assist him in drafting his final farewell address. No amount of special pleading from anyone could have changed his mind about retirement this time, and Hamilton did not even try. Hamilton decided that the announcement must, in its very tone and language, be discernibly Republican, and it was imperative that his decision to step down be perceived as a voluntary act, another dramatic surrender of power, his last and greatest exit. Washington was the author whose ideas prevailed throughout the address, but Hamilton was the draftsman who wrote most of the words. An American classic, the farewell address was a seminal statement of American isolationism. It warned that all treaties with foreign powers were merely temporary arrangements designed to be discarded once those foreign interests shifted. There were paragraphs urging New Englanders and Virginians to think of themselves as Americans, to understand that their regional differences were complementary strengths in a flourishing national mosaic. Washington pled for a national university in the new capital designed to congregate the rising generation of future leaders on common ground. He pressed that American independence, if it were to endure, required a federal government capable of coercing the states to behave responsibly, a stance that put him squarely at odds with the Republican argument that a sovereign national government violated the spirit of '76. In a nutshell, Washington stressed for independence abroad and unity at home. He was going out the way he came in, dignified, defiant, and decisive. Clear about what was primary and what was peripheral, confident about where history was headed. Two huge subjects, slavery and Indian policy, were conspicuously missing from the farewell address, primarily because Washington wanted to sound a unifying note, and these topics had proven resistant to compromise or even civil conversation. Washington himself had conceded that slavery was the one issue that could not be pushed forward without placing the entire national experiment at risk. He did decide to publish an open letter to the Cherokee Nation. No tribe had done as much as the Cherokee to accommodate itself to white encroachments on its tribal land and to adapt its own customs to permit peaceful coexistence with the advancing wave of white settlers. Washington saw the Cherokees as perhaps the best hope for making his vision of sovereign Indian enclaves within the United States a reality. If the Cherokees would continue to do their part, Washington promised that the federal government would enforce the treaties honorably so as to assure Cherokee survival as a people and a nation. In his final address to Congress, Washington sounded an upbeat prognosis. British troops were evacuating their western posts, border disputes in Maine and Florida were being sensibly adjudicated, the economy was humming along nicely, a new treaty with the Creeks offered hope for an end to frontier violence in the Southwest. The only dark cloud remaining were the French raids on American shipping in the Caribbean, but surely the French would soon come to their senses. Then Washington made several recommendations. The nation desperately needed a small navy, and it also needed a military academy. His old plea for a national university was reiterated, and he urged Congress to consider legislation to encourage the country's manufacturing abilities. He urged for increased salaries for federal employees in order to recruit the most talented and able citizens, and all of this culminated in a call for an expanded federal mandate, which the Republicans had always described as Hamiltonian. Washington wanted to leave no doubt that these were his ideas as well as Hamilton's. Though he had always considered himself above the fray, he was going out an avowed Federalist. He was surely pleased when John Adams won a narrow electoral victory, since Adams' victory meant a continuation of Federalist policies. His one piece of advice to the incoming John Adams was for Adams to retain his son John Quincy in foreign service. The call Washington made for an expanded federal mandate was so robust that nothing like it would be proposed again until 1824, when John Quincy Adams assumed the presidency. Chapter 7, Testament. While Washington had been away tending to the business of the nation, no one had been tending to the business at Mount Vernon, at least not up to his exacting standards. As a living legend, Washington accepted the fact that he himself remained property of the public, and an ever-revolving cavalcade of visitors and callers at Mount Vernon was to be expected for the remainder of his life. He was thankfully aging gracefully, putting the lie to all those Jeffersonian rumors of his imminent descent into decrepitude and senility. He began yet another major renovation of his plantation home to accommodate his retirement. Economically, Mount Vernon had long since ceased to be a plantation in the Tidewater with tobacco and wheat as its chief cash crops. It had become a highly diversified collection of farms dedicated to multiple crops and livestock, most of which were consumed on the premises. However, he unfortunately allowed himself to become a pawn in a dangerous scheme that threatened the Republican experiment and eventually killed the Federalist Party. Thomas Paine wrote an open letter to Washington in which he actually prayed for Washington's imminent death, puzzling whether Washington was an apostate or an impostor, whether he had abandoned good principles or whether he ever had any. Other editorials described Washington as a tyrannical monster and his farewell address as the loathings of a sick mind. Thomas Jefferson's nephew wrote a letter to Washington under a false name, hoping to generate incriminating evidence of Washington's anti-French sentiments that the Republicans could circulate against him. Whether Jefferson was involved in this plot directly to stigmatize Washington is unclear, but Washington's willingness to believe so put another nail in the coffin of their relationship. Meanwhile, Jefferson and Madison were so caught up in their conspiratorial indictment of the Federalists, they lacked any perspective on how their own conduct appeared when viewed from the enemy's camp. Jefferson and Madison had in fact been orchestrating a concerted and covert campaign against the Federalists as far back as 1791. They had played politics with foreign policy during the debate over the Jay Treaty. They had paid scandalmongers to libel both Hamilton and Washington, and they had on several occasions engaged in skullduggery that would have been regarded as treasonable in any modern court of law. War hysteria ensued after President John Adams released dispatches revealing that the French had demanded a bribe as a precondition for negotiating with American peace envoys, revelations that dramatically reversed public support of the French Revolution and created a surge of hostility against French supporters in America. Washington responded calmly but tacitly endorsed 4 pieces of legislation rushed through Congress by Federalist extremists known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which called for deportation of foreign-born residents suspected of French sympathies and shut down newspapers publishing any false, scandalous, or malicious writings against the government of the United States. John Adams subsequently acknowledged that signing the Alien and Sedition Acts was the biggest blunder of his presidency, but the acts did not appear flagrant to Washington, who remained convinced that the Republicans had been waging a subversive campaign for many years against the very legitimacy of the elected government. The Federalists were now aiming to silence their political opponents, and Washington can be said with certainty to have cheered them on in doing so from the sidelines. Meanwhile, Hamilton had hatched a scheme to transform the Provisional Army into a permanent military establishment and an instrument for his expanded power within the Federalist Party. Washington would likely have condemned the more bizarre features of Hamilton's plot had he known what was afoot. But Hamilton was inadvertently undoing all of Washington's painstaking work, and almost as bad, Washington's complicity in the plot lent credibility to the Republican claim that the old patriarch was a rather dazed frontman for the conspiratorial manipulations of an evil genius behind the curtain. Both the Federalists and the Republicans believed that the fate of the Republic was very much at risk in 1798. Both sides viewed the crisis through the prism of the American Revolution. The Republicans saw Hamilton's Provisional Army as an ominous acknowledgement that it was intended to remain intact forever, a domestic version of the standing army the British had imposed on the colonies in the 1770s. The Federalists saw it as a second coming of the Continental Army, which had not only won an improbable victory over Great Britain, but also had provided the only reliable source of national unity when all else was collapsing in huge heaps of political and economic chaos. Washington was uniquely vulnerable to the Federalist interpretation since it touched all the patriotic chords that reverberated in his memory. John Adams himself never believed that the French intended to invade America, and even if they did, he preferred a naval buildup over an enlarged army. His antenna perked up as the enormous scale of planning for Hamilton's army took shape, and his personal loathing for Hamilton made him suspicious in all the ways that Washington was gullible. In February of 1799, he stunned Federalists and Republicans alike by announcing his decision to send another peace commission to France. With one simple stroke, Adams eliminated the prospect of war and thereby destroyed the rationale for the new army. All of Hamilton's hopes for military glory died with Adams's decision. Washington questioned the impulsiveness of the Adams decision, never fully understanding how Adams had actually rescued him from an embarrassing blunder and the nation itself from a dangerous brush with martial law. Washington remained oblivious to the political machinations that had gone on behind the scenes to manipulate his cooperation until he was provided with a candid account of the rampant subversion within the Adams cabinet. Washington vowed to never again allow himself to be drawn into any decision facing the executive branch. His remaining energies had plenty of problems to focus on within the confines of Mount Vernon. The steady procession of house guests that made Mount Vernon essentially a hotel, the endless negotiations about construction schedules at the federal city, and requests for financial assistance from indigent relatives occupied much of Washington's time. The other thing preoccupying his mind yet again was what in the world to do with the hundreds of slaves that he owned. The last time Washington had been able to dedicate time to his slavery problem was during his first retirement in the 1780s. 3 points are worth noting about his thinking at that stage. First, it represented a dramatic advance over his previous moral numbness on the issue, an advance that had been fostered by his experience commanding black troops during the war and his exposure to anti-slavery opinions never before encountered in the pre-revolutionary Virginia in which he lived. Second, he was interested in liberating himself from slavery, but not in liberating his slaves, whom he still regarded as his property and therefore valuable parts of his personal estate not to be surrendered without compensation. Third, he had found his efforts to sell his slaves blocked, ironically by his moral determination not to break up families, who were very much intermarried with the slaves owned by Martha and the Augustus estate. Hovering over this complex tangle of moral and economic considerations was a personal calculus about his own legacy. He knew that his place in posterity's judgment depended on getting this issue right as much as on any decision he had ever made as commander-in-chief. In May of 1794, 3 years before his retirement, he schemed to sell off all of his western lands so that he and Martha could live comfortably in retirement on the interests of these sales. He expressed to a friend that he desired to liberate a certain species of property which he possessed very repugnantly to his own feelings. The full outline of his plan materialized 2 years later when he took out advertisements for the sale of his lands. The trouble with his plan was that its ultimate goal, the emancipation of his slaves, was the final step in a lengthy series of economic transactions, which effectively meant that the moral principle was held hostage to the caprice of the marketplace. Unfortunately, all the major deals for the sale of his lands fell through, and this plan did not work out as he had hoped. The question of why he did not just free his slaves outright has been debated for all of these centuries since. First of all, Washington did not think about slavery exclusively in moral terms. Just as his own slaves and the dour slaves were entangled on his farm, his conscience and his more self-interested calculations were entangled in his mind. Quaker critics pleaded with him to act on principle, but he never took their advice. Quakers had been pacifists during the war, and if he allowed himself to be guided by their uncorrupted idealism on that occasion, he and they would still be subjects of the British Empire. Secondly, Washington relentlessly insisted that ideals must never define his agenda. He associated an idealistic agenda with sentimental illusions. During his presidency, he had opposed federal action on a gradual emancipation scheme despite a personal acknowledgement of its moral rightness, because the issue threatened to split the nation at the moment of its birth. He was deeply suspicious of any idealistic agenda that floated above the realities of power on the ground. Thirdly, he was determined to defer emancipation until he was assured that his own financial independence was secure. There is some reason to believe that his wife Martha did not share her husband's principled aversion to slavery or agree with his emancipation plans. Even if she had agreed, she did not own her own dour slaves. They were part of the Custis estate, which legally were required to be passed along to her descendants and her heirs. It was becoming obvious to Washington that his complex scheme for property consolidation to be followed by human emancipation was not progressing according to schedule. The drafting of his final will and testament was his way of assuring that if he was not able to implement the plan while he was alive, he could at least do so from beyond the grave. Washington was hardly the impoverished farmer in his later years that he claimed to be. He did have what we would call a cash flow problem, meaning that his assets were tied up in land rather than in more liquid forms of wealth. But in fact, Washington was one of the richest men in America. The core of his wealth had been acquired early in his life as a result of his prominent role in the French and Indian War. Nothing that he ever did as America's preeminent soldier and statesman paid the same economic dividends as his youthful service on behalf of the British Crown. When he wrote out a list of his property and possessions, he revealed that there were 317 slaves at Mount Vernon, of which he owned 124 outright, plus another 40 that he had leased from a neighbor, meaning that he had control of less than half of those on the premises. He stipulated that, upon the death of his wife, it was his will that all of the slaves that he held in his own right should be freed outright. He stipulated that, once freed, all the old and infirm slaves should be comfortably kept in their later years by his heirs, and the young slaves should be supported until they reached adulthood, taught to read, and brought up into some useful occupation. The only slave that was freed outright on Washington's death was his faithful servant, Billy Lee. As far as the fortune that he had accumulated, there would be an equal division among 23 heirs. Mount Vernon was to be split into 5 separate plots for 5 different heirs. The equal distribution meant that none of his heirs would receive more than a modest nest egg, and none would be guaranteed a head start in life. At some point, he finally accepted that political parties were transforming the shape of national politics, making character as he understood it irrelevant, even a liability. The new ground rules, soon to triumph in the new century, struck him as both alien and awful, and a world in which he had no place. On December 12, 1799, in apparently relatively good health, Washington rode his horse for 5 hours around his property in a sleeting, snowing hailstorm. The following day, he began to exhibit signs of illness, which medical experts in recent times have concluded was probably some sort of virulent bacterial infection of the epiglottis. Washington enjoyed the best care that medical science of his time could provide, but unfortunately everything the doctors did to help him only made matters worse and essentially tortured him to death. They bled him 4 times, extracting more than 5 pints of blood. They blistered him around the neck. They administered strong laxatives, but nothing could treat the infection. Washington's epiglottis only continued to swell, making eating and even breathing extremely difficult, eventually impossible. Eventually, he ordered the doctors to cease their barbarisms and let him go in peace. There were no ministers in the room, no prayers uttered, no Christian rituals offering the solace of everlasting peace at the deathbed. His last words were to his body servant, Christopher, who had been standing for many hours, and Washington invited him to sit down and rest. His last act, taking charge for the final time in his life, was to feel his own pulse as he expired. In the eulogy that has echoed through the ages, Henry Lee proclaimed that Washington was the first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. A second memorable eulogy by Gouverneur Morris made an intriguing connection between Washington's grasp of the dynamics of power and his grip on himself. For Washington, the American Revolution had not been about destroying political power, but rather for seizing it and using it wisely. Ultimately, his life had been about facing power. Facing it, taming it, channeling it, and projecting it. All the surrenders he had made paved the way to larger acquisitions, a great fortune, victory in the war, and secular immortality. All the disciplined denials were also occasions to catch the next wave forward. He understood that the greatest glory resided in the judgment of posterity. By aspiring to live forever in the memory of future generations, one must demonstrate the ultimate self-confidence to leave the final judgment to them. With that, guys, I have rambled on long enough. That will wrap up the first chapter in the journey I am taking through the lives of American presidents, one biography at a time. This book, titled His Excellency by Joseph J. Ellis, was so enjoyable. I actually read it cover to cover 2 times completely, and as you can see, highlighted extensive parts of it to read and share here in this video. I hope if you stuck around this long, you enjoyed the information and taking this great book to a nearby little free library with me. From here, we will continue forward in the order, exploring each leader through the pages of a single biography. I'm looking forward to what the next book teaches me and where it takes me, and I look forward to sharing that journey with you.